Thank you very much, Marco, and it's important that we bring in the perspective of the child and also give priority to listening to the views of the children themselves, so I think that was an important intervention. Okay, my presentation now will keep short. I wanted briefly to introduce EuroChild and then look at the current changes within the European Union and the context of the Europe 2020 strategy that was adopted by the European Union last year and is setting the direction for the European Union for the coming 10 years. And then briefly what that means, it won't be very comprehensive, but looking at some of the policy areas which I think present opportunities but also threats in relation to the situation of children who are left behind, and a short conclusion and way forward. So some of you are familiar with EuroChild. We are a European umbrella network. We're based in Brussels. We have now some 135 members, including individuals and organisations and national organisations such as della, Vita, but also national and regional umbrella networks. Very broad membership base, and I think this is a fundamental strength of the network because we bring in both statutory bodies, NGOs, really looking at the perspective of the best interest of the child from all those that are committed to working in that direction. And we are based, all of our work is fundamentally based on implementation of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. We actually have core funding from the European Union, so funded through the European Commission, DG Employment and Social Affairs. In the context of their work on social inclusion, they fund a number of different networks in many different areas to strengthen the involvement of civil society and actors within the individual member states who can themselves also place pressure on the member state governments to give priority to social inclusion issues. And our activities are based on two broad lines. So as I mentioned, mainstreaming, implementing the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and a specific focus on the situation of children living in poverty or in marginalised situations. So this topic area of children left behind is very, very important for us. And I think the next slide is really looking at the situation of children and one of the major push factors of parents leaving children and going to seek work and better quality of life, particularly east to west. And the next slide is really the situation of children in child poverty. This data is pre-crisis, so we have to remember that pre-crisis there was 1 in 5 children living at risk of poverty across the European Union, and very broad range of situations across the EU. So we can see those countries particularly have high numbers of parents leaving, or those with obviously highest levels of poverty, social exclusion. In Bulgaria, I think it was 33% in 2008 figures, and Romania also over 30%. And those figures for Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, some of the countries we'll be looking at today. I think actually the next two slides, the next one is very data dense. And so perhaps we'll go to the following one, Ivano, because that's the picture of the European Union. This is actually a compilation of data I'm actually stealing from a member of ours, Wesislawa Wojtowa, I can't pronounce her name very well, a Polish researcher at the University of Lodz who presented the situation in Poland in our annual conference last year. And they'd actually put together some composite indicators combining both relative poverty but also material deprivation, access and use of childcare, some health indicators. And this picture demonstrates very clearly the red being those that have worse levels of child well-being, and those with the highest, particularly in the Nordic countries. I can give more details of how those indicators were put together, but I think it just shows a very clear picture of the situation across the European Union and some of the push factors that are forcing parents to look elsewhere for work and for better quality of life. So I think it's very important to remember in this discourse it's not a question of demonising parents, that it is a question of looking at what are the root causes of parents looking elsewhere to move and how we can address those root causes. So for us, fundamental basis of our work would be to give priority to addressing the root causes of child poverty, social exclusion, and ensuring that we focus on child well-being in its broadest sense, not only from an income poverty dimension, but also looking more broadly at children's well-being and material deprivation, access to education, social welfare, early childhood, etc. Just this slide also, I mean, as I mentioned, the data always has a time lag, and we're now in a situation where the financial economic crisis has had huge impacts, joblessness, in-work poverty, but also, very worryingly, across a broad range of EU member states, the responses to that crisis and how member states are actually dealing with the fiscal consolidation austerity measures, and many of those are affecting the services that are really delivering the most necessary service to children and families in need. So we produced a paper earlier in the year, which is available at the back of the room, but looking very broadly from the data given to us from the members around the situation that both frontline services through local authorities, but also NGOs and others are facing as a result, and material deprivation. So that actually sets the framework. It means all member states are obliged to report on their strategies, their own individual targets to reach that 2020 target. And there is a flagship initiative, Platform Against Poverty. It's a communication that came out late last year, which includes a commitment to develop a recommendation on child poverty and well-being, which has been emerged as a clear priority of the European Union over the last 4 or 5 years. Alongside that, there is this the emphasis, and what we've seen since the definition of the strategy in the middle of last year. Now we're in the phase of the first stages of implementation. And earlier this year, there was the report from the European Union, the Annual Growth Survey, that looked at the draft reports coming out of member states, which has a clear focus on economic growth, employment growth, and it's almost like it's a strategy for growth, meaning economic growth, and then if possible, we can make it smart, inclusive and sustainable. So it's really very evident that the priority is not, although we achieved some integration of social objectives into the broader picture, it's by no means a balanced picture. So there's very little or no acknowledgement of the need for investment in social services as a prerequisite for sustained economic recovery. And the national reform programmes, which are basically the backbone of the Europe 2020 strategy and what member states will do to achieve those targets, has very minimal focus on social concerns. We have had over the last 10 years a framework of cooperation between the 27 member states, the open method of coordination, which has provided some framework and direction. So they had common objectives, common indicators, common research, and we're not sure. I mean, there is a commitment that will continue, but we're not sure in what form. And so that creates some degree of uncertainty about the priority and the attention that will be given to social inclusion. So we have a long way to go. My next slide is looking then at what it means for children left behind, and I want to draw attention to one of the communications that links to the targets related to employment. There is a target to obviously for 2020 to increase employment, and a big focus of that communication, which is an agenda for new skills and jobs, is the focus on labour market mobility. I mean, you'll be aware that labour market mobility is a fundamental principle of the European Union, and they see it as being a major driver of economic growth. So I think we cannot get away from that, and that will be the context of the European Union for the coming 10 years. And clearly the emphasis within that text is promoting labour mobility, and there is very little, no mention of the social or human cost or implications of that. There is an upcoming publication of a new agenda for integration of third country nationals that should be launched this year. There's an analysis of the migration policies to labour market skills and skills matching. There's some mention about quality of jobs, of ensuring that there is reducing precariousness in the job market, but it's clearly a very strong focus on labour market mobility and economic growth. And then, in parallel to that, there has been this communication on the platform against poverty, which for us provides a useful framework. But now the question is how that will be implemented and whether there will be concerted effort on the part of member states to give due attention. I think one of the opportunities is the strong link with the EU's funding instruments and mechanisms, and I think we need to explore that in much more detail, how we ensure that the European Social Fund, which has been so far very much focused on labour market and training, how we can ensure that that's used for child poverty and well-being, given that that's a clear priority of the European Union. And then that can be used. I mean, we're seeing it now in some countries about Bulgaria, for example, is using the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund to support its action plan on deinstitutionalisation, so reducing numbers of children in institutions. And it's all about ensuring the services exist to prevent children from going into care and ensuring the best possible alternative care services where they cannot remain in with their biological parents. So I think that there are precedents there which we can build on to ensure that the funding mechanisms are used most effectively, particularly in the Eastern European countries. And then also looking at the forthcoming recommendation on child poverty and well-being, that we keep a broad overarching focus on child poverty, that we don't reduce it to employment and income poverty, which has been one of the risks, and we ensure that it's underpinned by a child rights focus. So my last slide, in relation to how we move forward, I would like to stress that the protection of children's rights is now an explicit objective of the European Union within the Lisbon Treaty, adopted in December 2009. How that will be then implemented, there was a communication some 2 weeks ago from DG Justice, which is their agenda for mainstreaming children's rights across EU policies and action. There is some attention there given to how all DGs, all the departments in the European Union can underpin their policies with a children's rights approach. It's not as ambitious and as detailed as we would like to see, but there is something there nonetheless that we can build on. So I think that's an important framework, but for us we would be really looking at how we can ensure that within countries of origin we're focusing on reducing child poverty, promoting well-being, using the EU instruments available to them to give the appropriate focus. And looking at countries of destination, how we can ensure that EU policies don't just look at employment and growth alone, but look at inclusiveness and marginalisation and addressing issues of discrimination and integration. So those would be our main areas of focus. I would like to finish here. I know this has been kind of a slightly different presentation to what the rest of the presentations you will hear this morning, but I think in the context of this afternoon's debate in the European Parliament, it's important to remember the sort of broader EU context, and I know some of these issues have been raised within the call for action that Alberto Vita has drafted. So, thank you very much.